Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of What Israel Is. Got my cup of coffee here, and I'm ready to go. So, I want to begin by discussing or continuing the discussion about Bibi's maneuver last week. It seems to me that there is somewhat of an impact here of something I call the hyper real television effect, wherein within our minds we kind of supplant what is real with what is entertaining. I mean it to say that, for example, when people look for what romance should be like, they use chick flicks as a reference. Where when people want to look for what sex should be like, they use porn as a reference. And when they look at, they try to look into what politics should be like or are like, they look at House of Cards and Game of Thrones as a reference. Obviously, entertainment is not reality, and even were you to consider that there may be some insights into reality to be gleaned from entertainment, that is still not a real indication of what things are actually like, especially since they are usually muddled by all sorts of manipulations, things that are done purely with the intent of entertaining. So while Bibi's power play might have made for good entertainment, in as much as it could have appeared on House of Cards, those things aren't quite as neat in real life as they are on television. So, the plot thickens. Even as Benjamin Netanyahu was finalizing his deal with Avigdor Lieberman, or Yvette Lieberman, something happened. Apparently, Lieberman wasn't negotiating quite as enthusiastically as might have been expected, and his eyes were so blinded by the promise of the Ministry of Defense that he neglected some of his running tickets. For example, Lieberman's party, for all of its evils, promises social aid. They started by running with the ticket of helping what we call olim chadashim, new immigrants into Israel, usually from lands of the former Russian Union, Soviet Union. But nowadays they deal with all sorts of immigrants, specifically one member of the Knesset, member of the parliament, Orly Levy Abexis, whose father was also a member of the Knesset at a time. She has won it's not really anything formal, but a title of social rights champion for several consecutive years. And she a member of Avigdor Lieberman's party, left the party, quit, essentially, when the details of the deal between Lieberman and Bibi came into light. So that's one part of how things got muddled up. Another part is how members of the coalition reacted to the deal. Obviously, within the opposition, there was a lot of criticism directed at Bougie Herzog, of which I spoke last episode, about how he handled the negotiations, about how he went into the negotiations to begin with. But within the coalition, things were no less dramatic. So, for example, now we have a reigning minister from the Kulanu party, which is a centrist movement within the coalition, quitting as well, because of the head of the party's lack of willingness to react strongly to what we are seeing now. And we have the head of another party within the coalition, called the party is called Habayit Hayehudi, the Jewish House, which is a strongly right-wing, religious, nationalistic party. So he, Naftali Bennett, the head of the party, is also making some not-so-veiled threats about wanting to renegotiate his terms of staying within the coalition, seeing as how Netanyahu is now already on the board table, drawing all sorts of negotiations. So it's the right time to strong arm him. And we also have Lieberman himself, who is also stalling. No pun intended or reference to Stalin. He was actually just almost as soon as information about the deal was coming out, Lieberman said that the deal is not finalized and there are still more things that he wants out of it. And if all of that wasn't enough, we also have a about 10-year-old legal thing coming out of the woodwork. A story that is called the Bibi Tours story. Essentially, at the time, Benjamin Netanyahu was Minister of the Treasury, and as such, he received all sorts of services and goods, which, they're bribes. That's all they are. So that's coming back to haunt Netanyahu. It's not something that wasn't known beforehand, but it seems that Netanyahu pulled all sorts of strings to put it on the hush, or at least not suffer any legal ramifications from that story. But a report came out about the whole affair, and we may yet see some consequences from this. So that's it for the news part. And I will now continue discussing what really Jews are. So we were talking about the formation of Rabbinical Judaism. I explained what the halakha is, a corpus of religious laws, of dogma, which is not derived immediately from the Holy Scripture. Some of it is supposedly extrapolated from the text through the lens of interpretation, but from a person who has read some of those extrapolations, though not nearly enough, I can say that those are usually they're a stretch. And then another part of the halakha are supposedly oral laws that existed according to tradition from the days of Moses and were passed from father to son. So we are at a point of what we call Chazal. Chazal is an acronym in Hebrew for Chachmeinu Zichram Livracha, which means our wise men, may their memory be a blessing. And they were also known as the Sanhedrin, the assembly of wise men in charge of religious legislation, etc. Okay? They are essentially the beginning of traditional Rabbinical Judaism, and they led the Jewish people, offered them religious leadership up until the days of what we call the diaspora. There are points to speak about the diaspora itself, but I won't do it quite now. It is more of a historical thing to discuss just how widespread the diaspora was and whether or not there was an exile. But as I said, that's a point for a different episode, so I won't handle that topic quite now. So what we have, once we go into the Middle Ages, is we have Jews living within communities, neighboring, or actually within the kingdoms or caliphates of other people, of other sovereign nations who are of an Abrahamic faith. Obviously, that is not the case with Jews in India, but that's a different topic. But we have Jews living within Christian and Muslim countries. Now, the way it went was that they were I don't want to say really protected, but I guess that's what it is, a protected minority. I suppose that when considering that there weren't really minorities at the time, least of all religious minorities, living within other nations, there was something special about the status of Jews in those countries. So we had the whole reason why Jews were allowed to live or abide within Christian and Muslim nations has a lot to do with the idea of Jews as progenitors, as the people who began it all, who started it all. Obviously, within Christian faith, there is a lot to be said about demonization of Jews. That is, they might have started it, but they also ruined it, as far as the Christian faith referred to them. But even yet, there was a purpose to having the demon at hand. There was something to be said about looking at the Jews you were making miserable and pointing at them and saying, "You see, son, this is justice. This is what God has given them." Now, that is not to say that the lot of Jews within Muslim countries was a lot better. They were considered dhimmi. Dhimmi being, or a person of the book. The people of the book is the legal definition within Muslim law of Christians and Jews, and they are treated differently than other infidels. The people of the book, the dhimmis, are essentially also a protected minority who they suffer some persecutions but are not outright killed, which is what makes them different from other infidels. Essentially, the faith of Islam prevents or prohibits violent persecution of dhimmis unless they do not defer to Islamic law, as taxes, etc. But they were treated somewhat better, Jews were at least treated somewhat better within Muslim countries when comparing their lot within Christian countries, at least at the time. That is not to say also that there were no tensions. Within the Quran itself, we have several stories of Muhammad's interaction with Jews, and those did not always end very favorably. And even when discarding the religious texts themselves, I found that one of the first major instances of a pogrom within Europe was actually in Islamic Spain, the massacre of Granada. I might go deeper into it if I decide to tackle anti-Semitism's history, but that's just one point. Now, all of this, it is worthy to just speak for a moment about how pogroms were a thing that happened. All of this, from all of this sprouted several religious laws and religious observances. We have, for example, Jews. Well, this is not something inherent to Judaism, but we have Jews that had to somehow wear distinctive clothing. This was within the law. They were obligated to wear some sort of distinctive clothing so people will know them for what they are. But we had within the halakha things like an extension to the law of bastardry. Now, within Judaism, a bastard is not what you know a bastard to be. A bastard within Judaism is not simply a child born out of wedlock, but a child born of a woman wed, not of her husband. And a bastard within halakha, within Jewish law, may not wed, and his condition as a bastard is hereditary. So this is a big deal for Orthodox Jews, and this is something that they like to wave around as a threat. But because of pillaging and rape being a thing that happened to Jews specifically, a law was put into place that a child born to a woman wed out of rape, and not from her husband, obviously, will not be considered a bastard. This is a rare occurrence of religion being accommodating like that. But that happened. Another interesting thing that happened at that time was that we had disputations, where if we're talking about how useful Jews were within a religious context, what would happen is that the church would invite rabbis for jousts. But instead of lances and horses, they would joust with words about theology, trying to prove through sophistry the superiority of each faction's faith. Now, we're going to leap several years ahead, but again, in the Baroque, in the time of the Baroque, in what was no longer the Byzantine Empire, but now the Ottoman Empire, in a city named Izmir, we had a special character. This was a time of, apocalyptic talks. Nearing the time of 1666, we had all sorts of Christians talking about the doom of the world and the apocalypse, and this had a profound effect on Jews for whatever reason. Well, for one thing, we had a very apocalyptic seeming event happen in the north and east. What is now Ukraine, we had a new nation that came into being, and that with a grotesque amount of Jewish blood spilled. This is the Kozak Nation, the Kozak Kingdom, which was essentially a satellite kingdom of the Russian Empire, and its founder, Bogdan Khmelnytsky or something like that. I'm really not that good at pronouncing that name. Was no lover of the Jews. So we had huge pogroms taking place at that time, and that certainly lent to the Jews being affected by the Christian talks of the apocalypse coming. And within this framework, this particular time, came a very bright young person with a lot of knowledge about Jewish mysticism, about Kabbalah, which is something that I might delve into deeper at a later stage. And with the help of a scholar who was originally from, I believe, Germany, but resided in Palestine, Israel. At that time, it was simply really a lawless place. That person being called Nathan of Gaza, or Nathan Gazati. So with that help, the bright student by the name of Sabbatai Zevi, or Shabtai Tzvi, rose into prominence as a religious leader, but not just as a religious leader, but as a supposed Messiah. This had a huge impact on the Jewish, all Jewish communities all over Europe and all over the Muslim world as well. Everybody wanted to see this Messiah, and everybody believed that he was the real thing. That is, until the Ottoman authorities started paying attention. What happened in the end was that Shabtai Tzvi was given an option of either dying a martyr for his believers or converting to Islam. He just chose the latter, and that was the end of this movement, this messianic movement and belief in him. Well, nearly. What happened was that two factions of believers in this messianic figure remained. Some converted to Islam after their after their leader, and practiced a form of crypto Judaism which incorporates Jewish mysticism and also Sufism, Muslim mysticism. They supposedly still exist in Turkey, possibly in other places, but they are very small in number and inconsequential. I know that there are some conspiracy theories that Kemal Atatürk, the founder of modern-day Turkey, was one such Jew, or crypto Jew. I don't hold a lot of stock in that theory, but it's there. A second faction of those who remained loyal to a point to Shabtai Tzvi as a messianic figure remained Jews, at least to a degree, And there's a very interesting story about what happened with them and a different leader that came afterwards, but that may wait for another time. Uh, Something that is interesting about these Sabbateans or Shavtaim is their effect on Judaism. What happened after the all of the smoke dispersed and all of the dust settled down is that rabbis were committed to preventing such a thing from ever happening again. To that effect, for example, they prohibited young people from studying Kabbalah, so that no young person will come into such a power without the knowledge of how to wield it with responsibility, supposedly. So that was the counter-reformation to what happened with Shabtai. But it wasn't as effective as they would have liked, because not 100 years later, we have a character in Eastern Europe by the name of Baal Shem Tov. That is not actually his name, but his title, the one that he is most well known by. Essentially, it means master of the good name. But Baal Shem or Baal Shem is a title that is not particular to him. Essentially, it means a practitioner of white magic. A person who has knowledge of a name or some names of God and can use those to manipulate reality. So Baal Shem Tov was claimed to be one such person, and he led maybe the first major reformation within Judaism. The Reformation was a movement from traditional strict halachic Judaism, not discarding the halacha, but maybe being a bit more flexible with regards to halacha. There's a very nice story within Hasidic circles. This is the movement that he founded, Hasidic Judaism, about, for example, a young man or a teen who, on the eve of the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, is tasked with reading from the book in the synagogue. But for whatever reason, he is struck with anxiety and cannot read. And he does the only thing he can in order to let out what is within, or does the only thing that he can do except for pray, which is he whistles. And by doing so, he draws great ire from the crowd, but the rabbi admonishes the congregation and tells them that this was prayer. So that gives you maybe some idea of what Hasidic Judaism was like They believed in a more a softer type of Orthodox Judaism, which was a lot more mystical in its leanings. And I find that those things usually come hand in hand. That the more mystical a particular faith it is, the more relaxed it is as far as laws. So that is, again, not to say that this is not Orthodox Judaism. To a big degree, to a really, it is still Orthodox Judaism. It is very much Rabbinical Judaism. There is a reveration of saints within this sect of the Hasidic Judaism. There is great rabbis are considered sainted, really, and people do pilgrimages to their tombs, and it is believed that simply by being within the company of of such a rabbi, or by being at the vicinity of his grave, something within the formation of whatever your molecules or something changes. You become a better person, and you get blessings, etc. And then we have something radically different happening in Central Europe. Pretty much at a contemporary to the Hasidic movement. We have the Enlightenment in Europe, and we have the beginning, the buds of the emancipation of Jews. There is one character there by the name of Moses Mendelssohn, a German Jew, who began to breach the defensive walls of the Jewish community. He studied the languages of the Gentiles. He studied their philosophies, and he actually befriended some. He was a philosopher, and he was an Orthodox rabbi. But the way he interacted with the Christians was made into somewhat of an example for those who decided on following his tracks. And in the early 1800s, we have the beginning of Reform Judaism. On the backdrop of the emancipation of Jews, we have Jews who are beginning to participate in academic life, in artistic life, who are beginning to become citizens, speak the languages of the land, etc. And with those changes, as well as the changes from without, the changes of people, maybe of tolerance and of the religion, Christianity, the changes there, we have a movement that seeks to accommodate Judaism to modernity. And they do this, for example, by changing the language of prayer. Traditionally, prayers are in Hebrew and in some parts Aramaic. For example, the Kaddish, which is a prayer most widely associated with the prayer for passing of the dead, but not just that. It is essentially our version of the Lord's Prayer. It is in Aramaic, so just that. But they made a shift of, for example, prayer in the language of the land. So no more Hebrew and Aramaic, but that is not the case in all Reformed congregations. And then we also have egalitarianism within the synagogue. Traditionally, synagogues are built in a way that only men are within the prayer hall, and women are within a different section which is walled off from the prayer hall, but has islets so that they can see what is occurring on the other side, and hear the words that are being said. So Reformed Judaism, for the most part, did away with that, and as we progress with the years, also did away with other restrictions, such as, for example, women can now be rabbis. Now, in the early 1900s, across the Atlantic, in America, in North America, we have some Reform Jews who felt that the movement of Reform Judaism is perhaps moving too fast, too far away from its roots. And in an act of maybe trying to preserve something and maybe halting down the pace of change, they formed a different brand of Judaism called conservative Judaism. It's a confusing denomination, but it's conservative when compared to Reform Judaism, essentially. We still have within conservative synagogues, we have female rabbis, we have homosexual rabbis, we have shared prayer, so women and men all pray in the same hall. We have all of that, but some things are still done the traditional way. So, for example, I was once at a Reform bar mitzvah, and I was kind of taken aback because almost no one wore a skull cap, a yarmulke, and the rabbi was playing the guitar. And it was a really peculiar experience for me, because I grew up attending a conservative synagogue. That is, again, my parents are both atheistic or agnostic at best. We are wholly secular, but there was a decision at home that we still observe holidays, and we want to still retain some kind of connection to Jewish tradition, etc. So in a conservative synagogue, you don't have, well, people wear, for example, yarmulkes. It would seem really bizarre for a person to go into the prayer hall without one. And you don't have things like such as speakers or microphones, or cameras are not allowed, and you don't have guitars. So it feels kind of more orthodox, but again, you have female rabbis, etc. So that was a brief look at what Rabbinical Judaism is like today. I might delve deeper at a later stage at really what each of those different types of Rabbinical Judaism are really like, but we'll see about that. In the meanwhile, I hope you learned something. If you have any comments, please leave them, subscribe, and have an awesome weekend. See you later, guys.